The majority of my content, I guess, is going to be coming from the Cash-Landrum UFO incident by John F. Schuessler, which was written in 1998. Now, John Schuessler was a contractor for NASA. He worked on the space shuttle program, and he was also deputy director of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which we have talked about, which I think it's cool that somebody who actually like worked for NASA and on the space shuttle program was a director of MUFON.
It's interesting because like if you ask a lot of people, it'd be like contradictory areas to work in.
Yeah, that's why it's so fascinating to me. But he worked very closely with the victims of this event to write this book. And the idea was to write their story down because they want to warn people about the dangers of UFOs, of government conspiracies, of government cover-ups. And they want to provide a guide as to what might happen if a UFO incident like this were to happen to you. So you can kind of have an idea of like what they went through.
Okay.
He assisted them with getting medical and legal help. He tracked down witnesses. He hired doctors, the works. This guy did everything. And the book is fascinating. It's basically just like a list of his investigation and what he found. So it's like less story form and more just, this is my investigation. These are the results.
Cool.
According to him, this case has never been solved or resolved in any ways. But the government, the American government, claims otherwise, as usual. So that's my main source. But again, I read interviews, I read articles, I read medical records. There is so much stuff going on here. Let's start with the incident itself.
Yeah.
So the story starts on the evening of December 29th, 1980. Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum were two women in their 50s living in Dayton, Texas.
Okay.
So Dayton is a small town about 30 minutes northeast of Houston, and it seems to be, or at least at the time, was a place where ranchers and oil workers tended to live. On this particular night, Betty and Vicki were hankering for some bingo.
As you do.
As you do. So they and Vicky's 7-year-old grandson, Colby, all pile into Betty's Oldsmobile, and they drive out looking for some good old people fun, which is weird because they're like in their early 50s. But, you know, bingos is big. Can't resist that bingo. So they end up driving to a few towns in the area on the prowl for those sweet, sweet bingo cards. But everything was closed. They checked out a VFW in Cleveland, Texas, which...
These are all Ohio names, too.
Isn't that
and
weird?
I'm getting, like, confused a little bit.
But they're all, like, within 15, 30-minute drives of each other. So they check out a VFW in Cleveland. They're disappointed because there's nothing there. They all pack back into the car, and they drive south to New Caney to check out the Legion Hall there that usually has games on Monday nights. But no dice. Wait, no bingo.
How old are these ladies again?
Like 52, 54.
Okay.
So early 50s.
Sure. For some reason, I don't know why, but I had like an idea in my head that these were like 30-somethings.
No.
Really they're in check with their future retired selves.
No, I mean, they're not old by any means.
No,
but yeah, no, they're not in their 30s. The 80s, man. No internet. Because
That's
now
true.
you just like Google it and be like, hey, is there bingo? Nah, I'll just stay home. But they had to literally drive for hours to like actively seek out bingo. And then be disappointed anyways. They give up after this and they decide to just get something to eat at a truck stop before just heading home. At this point, it's about 8:45 p.m., late December. So it's dark. They're driving down a highway. And the road is usually pretty busy, but this night it's fairly deserted.
A Monday night,
8:45 p.m., I guess. They mentioned that they seem to be the only car driving on the road at this time. They're probably not particularly paying attention. Like, they'd noticed that there were a bunch of other cars, but it's very deserted. So it's Betty's car. Betty's driving. Vicky's in the passenger seat. And 7-year-old Colby is just standing behind the driver's seat.
Standing?
Again, yes, the 80s. There's the seat belts were apparently optional. So he's like standing, and Betty and Vicky they describe their conversation. They're talking about the good old times, basically.
Oh
they're driving in an Oldsmobile to Bingo in Texas, talking about the good old days. When suddenly Colby is like, what is that? He sees this red streak of light in the sky, and Vicky and Betty are like not interested. And, they're talking to each other. It's like mom's talking,
He's not Bingo.
He's not Bingo. He's not the good old days. He's a 7-year-old just like pestering them while they're driving, as 7-year-olds do. So they initially ignore him. But then he grabs Vicky's face and turns it towards the light and is like, what is that?
Is she the driver?
No, she's the passenger.
Okay.
She's also his grandmother.
Okay. Yeah.
And finally, they notice it, like Vicky's like, fine. But they can't tell what it is. It doesn't look like a plane or a star or anything that they can like pinpoint. Betty thinks the closest thing she can think of is that like maybe there's a new mall or shopping center that got built and has like a spotlight up to draw attention. They don't do that very much anymore.
No.
With the spotlights. There was one place, a burger place, close to where I went to college that had one.
Yeah, I remember driving past it on the highway.
Yeah, but you don't see that anymore. Bring back the spotlight. That's the closest thing they could think of. But even looking at it, they were like, that's definitely not a spotlight. I have no idea what that is. And as they're talking about it, it's getting brighter and brighter and closer and lighting up more of the sky in front of them. Now, just as an aside for some backstory, it seems like Colby was essentially being raised by Vicky. So he was like less of a grandson and more of her son. Sometimes, like later on in the book, he refers to her as Mama.
Okay.
So it really doesn't make a difference to the story at all. But if you're wondering why a woman in her 50s has a 7-year-old kid.
Right, sure.
I mean, it's not unheard of, but maybe they're just like hanging out. Who knows?
He likes bingo.
Yeah. I mean, 7-year-old me was into bingo if there were prizes. Anyways. So the light's getting closer and closer. It's getting brighter and brighter. And Betty's like, well, I mean, like, I'm just going to keep driving. It's weird, but what am I supposed to do about it? I want to make my way home. But eventually it turned from just being a streak in the sky to a light the size of a car to being directly in front of them. And it was so bright that they described the experience as like the sky splitting open. And as their eyes adjust a little bit, they see that a couple 100 feet in front of them, there was an enormous metallic object just hanging in the sky. So the highway was lined with these big pine trees, and they describe it as towering above those trees, but the bottom of it reached to about halfway down the trees.
Okay.
And it was spewing fire from the bottom, kind of like rocket boosters, but like broken. Like it was just on fire at the bottom. And it was blocking their way down the highway because, apart from being halfway down the trees, the fire was just like spurting down. They couldn't drive through it or under it. So they were completely blocked in. And it was making this impossibly loud, booming, roaring sound and beeping as well. This mysterious beeping sound.
Okay.
It was enough that they had to yell to hear each other when they were talking, even though it was still a couple 100 feet in front of them.
Right.
This all happened so quickly. Like it went from being a streak in the sky to car size to right in front of them. Betty's still driving the car. Like she hasn't had time to register that she needs to stop the car yet. So this whole time they're barreling closer and closer and closer to it. And as they get closer to it, the car starts to get impossibly hot. Like they're inside of an oven. And they can feel themselves like burning alive. even though they're still probably 100 or so feet away from it.
Oh.
Colby freaks out and he climbs over the front seat as Betty is driving to get into Vicky's lap, which kind of spurs Betty to hit the gas.
The gas?
Yes, rather than the brake. Like her thought was if she could speed up as fast as she could drive under it.
Through the fire and flames.
Yes. So the interesting thing about the fire is that it's kind of coming like spurting. Like it'll be like whoosh and then off for a second and then whoosh and then off for a second.
Like a video game obstacle.
Yeah, kind of. Yes. Or like a malfunctioning rocket booster.
Okay.
So her thought is like, I'm going to drive under it. I just want to get past this. I don't know what's happening. I'm terrified.
These bingo ladies always love trying their luck.
That's right. But it was kind of like a fight or flight reaction, and she decided to go with flight. So she hit the gas, but an instant later, Vicky is like, you are going to get us burned alive. You're going to get us burned alive. She's continually screaming this. So Betty slams on the brakes so hard that they almost fly through the windshield.
Seatbelts.
Right? So they come to a stop about 150 feet away from whatever this thing is. At this point, everyone in the car is panicking. Panicking's not even the right word. They are fully convinced that they are about to die.
Right, yeah.
They're practically burning alive in a car 150 feet away from this enormous burning 200-foot tall metallic ship. And they describe it as being diamond shaped. So it comes out like it's wider on the sides, comes out to 2 points, and then up to a top. It's a diamond with the rocket boosters coming down. And it seems like it's breaking down. Like the flames aren't necessarily supposed to be there. Or if they are, it's malfunctioning somehow. Like it's burning in a way it's not supposed to be. The flames are coming and going. They're crazy hot. And the ship never crashes down to the ground. Like it's still hovering in the air. But it seems like it's stuck hanging there. Like it's like somebody's hitting the gas and the flames will go whoosh and the craft will rise up a couple feet.
Right.
And then the flames will immediately stop and the craft will fall back down a couple feet.
Just can't get traction.
Exactly. So it's kind of like a malfunctioning car.
Right.
You know, like they're hitting the gas. But in the air. Right. So it's like it's having engine problems and there they are. Just like literally stopped in front of it. So at this point, if it was me, I would have been like, put the car in reverse.
Yeah,
get out of there.
Turn around.
Right? Yeah. But with the burning and the noise and being blinded and the panic, they need like a second to figure out their situation. Betty is pretty quickly looking around and she notices the highway is very narrow and it has these deep ditches on either side. So she can't like pull a U-ey or anything easily. So they're basically stuck either going forward or putting the car in reverse. But she's so blinded by the light that she doesn't feel comfortable going in reverse because she would go into a ditch. So they're essentially stuck there. Their only other option is to get out of the car and run on foot, which is exactly what Betty tries to do. So her next instant thought, she opens the door, she bails, and she makes a run for it. But as soon as she gets out of the car, the heat immediately hits her and the light blinds her and she has no idea which direction to run or like even where the road is. She's pretty much completely blinded. All she has is this light in her eyes. So she's completely disoriented. She's standing outside of the car in this blistering heat like a deer in headlights. She can't even see the car. Vicky jumps out as well, and she runs a couple feet, and then she remembers, my grandson is here. Like, I'm obviously not going to leave my grandkid. He can't, like, I can't carry him. He can't run as fast as me. You know, if we go outside and he gets blinded as well, we're going to get separated. So we're staying in the car. That's like our only source of protection right now. And she's not going to abandon her grandson. As she's stepping out of the car, Colby also gets out of the car because he's like attached to her like Velcro.
Right.
Vicky has her left hand on top of the car. She sets her left hand down, immediately pulls it off, and it's just burned.
Ugh.
Colby, freaking out, just starts to make a run for it by himself. He's not thinking clearly. Vicky grabs him with one arm, and the best option in her mind is, we have to stay in the car. We don't know which direction we're running. What if he trips and falls into a ditch and breaks his neck? Like, what do we do? So she gets in the car, and Colby is hyperventilating so badly that she thinks he's about to have a heart attack. So Vicky's trying to calm him down. Well, at the same time, she's absolutely convinced that they're about to die. So she's calming him down by telling him that bright light is Jesus coming to take them. If you see Jesus coming out of that bright light, just know, we're going to a better place. That would not be calming to me as a 7-year-old, but no. I imagine he's not really listening.
Probably can't.
Right, and it's very loud. I don't know what's up with Betty, but Betty decides to walk towards the light to investigate what it might be. And she's able to drag her feet one step at a time, slowly, to the front of the car. And she stood there for 5 solid minutes, just staring at this light, burning, while Vicky is screaming, "Get back in the car! Get back in the car! You're burning alive! Get back in the car!" After about 5 minutes, she comes to her senses. She walks back to the car and she tries to open the door, but the handle is so blisteringly hot. She has to use a leather jacket that she's wearing as like a hot pad.
Sure.
To open the door. She eventually gets it open. She gets back in the car. She sits down and Vicky just starts screaming at her for being an idiot and leaving and standing in front of this burning thing by herself for 5 minutes. So they're all back in the car, nothing they can do. And they sit there, essentially convinced they're going to die, burning to death for about 15 minutes, while this thing screeches and tries to launch itself up in the air and burns in front of them. Suddenly, a huge stream of burning hot flames shoots out of the bottom of the ship, and it finally is able to rise above the trees. And it leaves. And it flies off towards Houston in that direction. And they watch it sail up and glide away, which you think would be the end of it. But no, 23 U.S. military helicopters fly after it.
I was going to say, if it's there that long, making that much of a ruckus, there's no way these 3 are the only ones that were aware of it.
Right. Well, we will see what the government has to say about it later, but they can't see the insignia necessarily on the side of these helicopters. They do notice that they're 2-bladed helicopters.
Okay.
Which are like not normal. You don't see those very often.
It's not like belonging to a hospital or something, because they usually have 4 blades.
But they fly so close that they can see some sort of American military insignia on the sides of them, but they're not close enough to be able to like pinpoint exactly what it was. Now, Betty later said that the helicopters looked like they were trying to help it and like lead it somewhere. Not that they were coming in to investigate, but like they were coming to guide it to land somewhere else safely. They had surrounded it, but weren't trying to pull it down. They were kind of signaling where it should go.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Either way, Betty and Vicky were like, we're going home. Like, we're done with this. We almost died. We're going home. So they just book it out of there as fast as they can. And they're ready to just like forget this happened.
I'm thinking, how does the car even run if it got that hot?
Well, it did turn off and it took them a few tries to restart it.
Well, sure. But I'm just thinking, like, if the car itself got so hot for 15 to 20 minutes, like, it's probably overheated in general, even if it was off the whole time.
Yeah, I don't know.
Just a thought.
Yeah, right. Well, as they're driving home, they're flipping through the radio because they're like, surely we are not the only people that noticed this. We saw military helicopters. This thing basically split the sky open. This has to be on the news. Well, they're flipping through all the channels as they're driving home. It's about like a 20, 30-minute drive home. And nothing. Absolutely no news about this at all. And at this point, they're all starting to feel sick. It starts off with them feeling like they've been sitting in the sun for too long. Like they feel burned.
Right.
Generally sunburned. They're starting to get these massive headaches. Their eyes are burning. They're starting to feel nauseous. Betty is starting to get these massive lumps forming on her head and her neck.
Was she radiated?
Well, that's the question. We'll see. But either way, they get back to Dayton. Betty drops Vicky off, Vicky and Colby, and she gets back to her home moderately safely. So that was the actual physical encounter. Whether it's a space UFO, government ship, a Russian military experiment, it's whatever it is, Russian. It's an unidentified flying object.
Right, yes.
But for the 3 victims, that specific event is over, but their problems have pretty much just started. When Vicky and Colby got home that night, they felt just completely awful. They were bright red. They looked like they'd been sitting in the sun all day, and they were like so thirsty.
Okay.
I was trying to say unquenchable thirst.
Okay.
So they get home, they're just chugging water, and they decide to go to bed because A, it's late at night, B, they feel sick. So Vicky is like, I'm just going to rub us down with some baby oil. Like at first she wanted to take like a cold bath, but like the water hurt her skin so bad that she ended up just kind of like sponge bathing herself and Colby, and then putting baby oil on, make sure their skin doesn't like dry out and fall off.
Okay.
So they all go to bed, but at 1 a.m., Colby starts viciously vomiting and diarrhea. And then she pretty quickly after started having the same symptoms. However, life apparently goes on, because when they wake up in the morning officially, her husband, Ernest, is like, where's my breakfast? So she gets up and she makes him breakfast, even though she is like leaking from both ends all over.
Skin probably too.
Yes. And then she wakes Colby up and is like, well, I still got to get to work. So she goes to work. She actually works for Betty. Betty owns a little restaurant in the area.
Okay.
Vicky's a waitress there. Betty, however, has sold the restaurant. She's moving to a nearby town, to a bigger space. So on this particular morning, Vicky had told Betty that she would help her pack up the restaurant.
Okay.
She gets there. Betty's not there. But Vicky's like, well, maybe she's suffering with the same things we are.
Wait, before you go on, did the husband have anything to say about their appearance?
No, he mentioned absolutely nothing.
Because I assume they're still very red.
Yes. It's mentioned she is very red and blistery, and she's barfing and having diarrhea, and the husband said nothing and she said nothing, and he went to work and she went to work.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, not my kind of relationship, but whatever works for everyone else.
And Colby went to school this day, I assume, or what?
No, Colby tagged along to the restaurant, and I imagine it's because it was December 29th. Oh, this would have been December 30th. I believe they're on like a Christmas holiday vacation. That makes
sense.
Vicky gets to the restaurant. Colby tags along. Betty's not there. Vicky's like, well, Betty's probably also feeling sick. She's probably running late. But, no rest. Must work.
Yep.
So she has her own key. She opens it up. She goes in. She starts packing things up. But she sends Colby to go check on her because Betty actually only lives about a third of a mile away. So Colby walks over to go check on Betty, make sure she's doing okay.
Okay.
So he knocks on the door and he knocks on the door and he knocks on the door. No answer. He goes back to the restaurant, tells Vicky. And at this time, the restaurant cook had showed up to also help pack up. And Vicky's like, hey, dude, can you go check on Betty?
Right.
Like maybe you can walk around and peek in the windows or whatever. Make sure she's okay. So he walks over there and he knocks on the door and he knocks on the door. No answer. He walks around back and he peeks in Betty's bedroom window to make sure she's okay. But she's not. She's clearly not okay. She is bright red. Her face and neck are completely swollen. Her eyes are almost swollen shut. She's got these lumps all over her face and neck, and she physically cannot leave the bed.
Yikes.
When he knocks on the window, she yells out, "Get Vicky. I need help." So Vicky comes to get her. She's trying to take care of her as best as she can, but, she can't make her eat. She can't get her to drink anything. Anytime she consumes anything, she immediately vomits it up. She refuses to go to a doctor, however. And I think partially because she's like, nah, I'm fine. But also, who's going to believe their story?
Well, it doesn't matter what happened as long as she gets medical help.
Right.
Because she's like Jabba the Hutt and can't move because she's engorged to a point that she's a slug.
Right. Well, Vicky eventually wraps her up in a blanket and gets her back to her own house to take care of her, because Betty clearly cannot take care of herself. She can't move at her legs. She's completely helpless. But eventually Vicky makes an executive decision after a couple days and gets Betty to a hospital because she's not improving at all. Now they get to the doctor and Vicky doesn't tell them what happened. She's like, "Oh, I think maybe Betty has blood clots or something. Can you check her out?" And the doctors are like, "This woman looks like a burn victim. So please tell us what happened." And Vicky's like, I have no idea. I thought it was just blood clots. Can you just check her out?" So the doctors, not getting anywhere, just treat Betty as a burn victim.
Right.
However, while she's at the hospital, she starts losing all of her hair. She gets these massive headaches, blisters, the vomiting is still happening, the diarrhea is still happening. Her daughter comes from out of town to visit her, walks into the room, looks at her mother, assumes she's in the wrong room because she doesn't recognize her at all. She's bald, swollen, balding. She has huge bald patches. Her face is swollen. She has to go ask a nurse to make sure she's in the correct room. And when she rubs her mom's forehead, or brushes her hair, water starts seeping out of her mom's forehead and into her hair, or what's left of her hair. And when she tries to touch her mom's hair, it just fell out in a big clump in her fingers. Ugh. Apparently, she got a little bit better over time because after being hospitalized for 17 days and running all the tests they can think of, the hospital discharges her.
Interesting. Okay.
But 6 days later, she gets worse again and ends up back in the hospital.
Okay.
Betty finally decides to tell the doctors what happened. And they didn't laugh at her. She was kind of expecting them to be like, "Yeah, okay." But, it was kind of clear they didn't believe her. But they were like, "Well, you should have told us this immediately. We would have maybe thought of a different way to treat you." But again, they're at a loss for what to do because nobody knows how to handle UFO burns, as far as we know. So they run more tests. They run blood tests and eye tests and tests with her hair and skin biopsies and x-rays and all of the possible tests you can run. And they don't find anything. They diagnose her with alopecia to explain the hair loss, and cellulitis to explain why her skin is red and swelling. She was basically never the same again, but there was no explanation. And she was admitted again and again and again and again over the years, probably at least once a year for chest pains. She was eventually diagnosed with bronchitis. She was diagnosed with different skin problems over the years. Her fingernails all fell out. And the only diagnosis she ever got was alopecia, which, if you don't know what that is, it's an immune disorder that causes hair loss. Right. Essentially. It has nothing to do with being burned. I don't know much about it, but it seems kind of we don't know what to diagnose you with, so this is the best we can come up with.
So at the time of her first being admitted to the hospital, and then she's there for 17 days or however long you said, do Vicky and Colby still have their red skin?
Yes. Okay. So here's the breakdown
why
for them.
wouldn't the doctors ask, like, you look like you're in bad shape too?
Vicky and Colby look like they've been sunburned with some blisters.
Okay.
Betty is on like a completely different level. And the thought is...
And I get that, but I'm just wondering, like, she and the kid are obviously, you know, like, experience some sort of burning.
Now, this is about like 3 or 4 days after the event. So I imagine their skin has healed a little bit, but they're still not looking great. The doctor would notice, but nothing that I read said anything about the doctors asking them about their condition. So Vicky and Colby also had their fair share of problems over the years. Vicky suffered from very similar hair loss. All of her nails completely fell out. Most of Betty's nails fell out, but she managed to retain a few of them. So good on her. Okay. But all of Vicky's nails completely fell out. She had the blisters, she had the vomiting, the diarrhea. It seems like it was very severe for her for a few months after the encounter. Got better, but never really went away. She ended up developing cataracts. She lost most of her hair and ended up having to wear a wig for a while. It did eventually grow back. She had eye and skin issues basically for the rest of her life. But again, not anything quite close to Betty. And the idea is because Betty spent a solid 5 minutes in front of, and Colby and Vicky were pretty much the entire time in the car, with the exception of like a few seconds when they had exited and gotten back in.
Yeah.
Colby does not seem to have gotten it nearly as bad. And again, I think that's because he spent even more time in the car than Vicky did, because Vicky had gotten out before he did, and then she ushered him back in the car.
Well, and kids bounce back better than a 50-year-old.
Yes, also. And I truly think that's part of it. He, despite being in the 2nd grade, had to go back into diapers for a couple of weeks. Like, he completely lost control of his bowels. But again, that resolved itself after a few weeks. Right. He ended up having eye problems, had to get glasses that he probably would not have otherwise had to get. He developed the same sensitivity to heat where he would blister if he got into like a bath that was warmer than room temperature. But most of his problems were psychological. Again, very understandable. He developed an intense fear of planes, helicopters, any kind of bright light, shooting stars. Anytime any of this would happen, he'd have these severe panic attacks, that sort of thing, which is devastating for an elementary school kid. But again, in the 80s, I don't imagine that people were very forthcoming with psychological help for that sort of phobia, especially if you are attributing it to a UFO. Now, there's extensive information about the medical records for these 3 victims: blood counts, eye exams, skin exam results, and all of them were completely open to having their lives pretty much publicized for the sake of figuring out what happened to them. Right. So you can find the results of all of the tests pretty much online. And to me, this kind of lends to their credibility as witnesses. Like, they're not hiding anything. Something
happened, for sure. Yeah.
The doctors even gave extensive testimony as to their conditions before and after the event. So, for instance, Betty had a heart bypass sometime in the late 70s. But other than that, she was considered completely healthy. She, in fact, was like very concerned about her appearance, was a perfectly healthy weight. She was just considered very healthy.
Sure.
And after this event, she lost a massive amount of weight. Her doctor, as well as the dermatologist, the neurologist, the ophthalmologist, other third parties, were all able to corroborate her symptoms. And Betty told them all the exact same story every time with no deviation. So they all consider her to be a very reliable witness. And the doctor that she went to at the hospital was the same doctor who had treated her for years before the event. So he knew her prior and stated that he never believed her to be untruthful.
Sure, yeah.
I'm not going to talk too much more about their medical stuff. You can find whatever information you want online. But essentially, the idea is they got very, very ill unexplainedly. And
so I assume they had to test for radiation, because that's what I've been thinking this whole time.
So we're going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
Put a pause on that, because it does not look like they were tested for radiation initially.
Sure.
In those initial hospitalizations. Even though they're sick and Betty is, she's pretty much dying at this point. I mean, she eventually gets breast cancer, has to have a mastectomy, but like in the immediate aftermath of the UFO encounter, she's dying.
Like they didn't think she would last.
Yeah, she is not doing well. Vicky was convinced she was going to die. Her mom came down to take care of her. Even if she isn't, it feels like she's dying. She's not doing well. They still want to know what happened to them, especially if you are dying. You want to know like who did this and how. But at first, they keep the story pretty quiet because, again, UFO stories aren't really something you're going to run around telling people about. You want people to take you seriously. The thing that really baffled them was that no matter what research they did, nobody seemed to know anything about it. Nobody, like there were no articles, nobody was coming up to say they saw something similar. And they saw military helicopters.
Right.
So obviously somebody else was aware of this happening, but there was no information about it. So while Betty was in the hospital, Vicky is going around. She's calling police agencies, radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, military agencies, looking for any information. She calls the Dayton police chief, who clearly like didn't really believe her, but he also didn't think she was lying. Like he didn't necessarily believe it was a UFO, but he was like, I know this woman.
Well, and I mean, their injuries too. Like
yes, and they have
clear
injuries. He's like, clearly she believes something happened to her, and clearly something happened to her. If she believes it's a UFO, the only thing I can do is give you the number to a UFO reporting center. So she calls them, tells them her story. They passed her story on to a friend of the author of this book, John Schuessler.
Okay.
He essentially gets a hold of the story and is the only one interested in investigating. So he starts the investigation. I mean, Betty even called NASA to figure it out, and NASA was like, we don't know what you're talking about. John Schuessler eventually gets in touch with Betty and Vicky about 10 weeks after the incident occurred. And again, this is when the investigation officially begins. Okay. So he hears about the story, he's looking into it, and then, after some time, he gets a hold of the actual victims to get her started.
Right.
Now, when John Schuessler gets involved, he starts by interviewing the victims. And I read all of these interviews, and they are all exactly the same. The story I told you about the event.
Yeah.
Their stories all line up. They all corroborate. The details from what I read are all the same. Following the interviews, he gets a new doctor involved to check out their medical records, which he was very easily able to obtain, except for Betty's blood results. Every time he contacted the hospital to get her blood results, the hospital was like, sorry, they're temporarily out of file. We can't give them to you. Over a year later, he managed to get them, which seemed a little sketchy to him, at least enough to write it down in this book.
Right.
Now, the new doctor was Dr. Peter Rank of Madison, Wisconsin, who happens to be an expert in radiology. Although these women and Colby, but his medical records aren't really as extensively covered because he was not as extensively tested.
He's a child.
Right. Although these women are super ill and they have lasting effects requiring intermittent hospitalizations for years, the only official diagnosis he has to go off of is Betty's alopecia, which again seems to just be a diagnosis they made because they couldn't think of anything else.
Right.
Or maybe they knew it was something else and they didn't want to admit it. So they were like, it's alopecia. You have alopecia and skin issues.
Sure.
I doubt that because they knew the doctors ahead of time. But again, you never know. Maybe the government got to them. Either way, Dr. Rank is convinced this isn't alopecia, and he has a lot of reasons. The tests that were done on Betty's hair were inconsistent with alopecia. The biopsies that she had showed different kinds of cells than are consistent with alopecia. He basically is like, I don't know why they would have come to the conclusion of alopecia other than the fact that you're losing your hair.
Right.
And In addition, the loss of their nails and the skin issues are very consistent with radiation poisoning.
Oh, and the immediate vomiting too.
Yes.
That's something that all these like people in Japan after the recent nuclear disasters that have happened there, like same types of symptoms.
Yes, exactly. So he concludes that Vicky and Betty are actually suffering from radiation poisoning, likely gamma rays, as they can penetrate skin better than alpha and beta particles.
Sure.
Now,
Okay.
I don't know anything about the difference between these. Apparently, like alpha and beta particles probably would have been stopped by the car if they were inside it.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, I don't know. But he goes on to say that whatever kind of radiation Betty and Vicky were exposed to, it was more penetrating than the most superficial types, but it still did not penetrate sufficiently to cause systemic signs and symptoms. It seems therefore safe to conclude at this time that Betty and Vicky sustained radiation damage which was confined to the skin and immediate subcutaneous area. He also says that the skin sensitivity, diarrhea, hair loss, and hair regrowth, as well as nail loss, are very consistent with radiation exposure. However, there was another doctor who looked at these, Dr. Brad Sparks, and he says that the extreme rapid onset of these symptoms means that they had to have been exposed to enough radiation to kill them within days. You know, the fact that they're still alive makes him think that it was not radiation poisoning. He's thinking that they were likely exposed to some kind of chemical.
Okay. I will say this, though, and obviously we are no experts
at all
on radiation and radiation poisoning and all of that. But in my mind, I'm thinking there aren't a whole lot of test subjects related to radiation poisoning and death by being radiated. So who's to say that, you know, they didn't experience enough radiation to kill them because they, for whatever reason, were just very... I guess the opposite of susceptible, right?
Yeah.
Like they're resistant to it.
There is a lot of studies into radiation, though.
No,
and
of
how
course,
it affects the human body.
But
So
I'm
like,
just thinking actual subjects that it has happened to.
Yeah, I mean, you can't
it's
ethically.
very limited.
Right. I don't know. Either way, though, suspicious. Either it's radiation or some unknown chemical
That was in the exhaust or
Yes.
the fire. Sure.
Right. So either way, sketch. Now, my question here is like, I would think that I understand why doctors would look at her and say, burn victim. Totally makes sense, right? Because
Right.
swollen, blistery red. But after that, with the continuing symptoms, wouldn't, because even you, a non-medical professional in any way, immediately thought radiation poisoning.
Right.
I don't-
And especially because of and they weren't very forthcoming with, you know, their story, so that, you know, could
Yes.
have been a deterrent in testing for radiation. But the immediate thought to me is signs of burning, but also nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Like, to me, that is radiation burning and
Mhm.
radiation exposure.
Yes. And that was my first thought as well. So it's just a little bit baffling to me that a doctor wouldn't be like,
That's what I was thinking too, but then that also says to me, maybe they did test for it and they, you know, maybe there's certain things that medical professionals have to report and then maybe they were silenced. I don't know.
completely possible. I don't know. It's bizarre to me because to me, again, just like you, my first thought would be radiation poisoning. So that is the situation of the event and what happened to them. So at this point, I am going to cut it off. And next week, we will discuss the investigation, the tests on Betty and Vicky's car, who they contacted. They look extensively into the helicopters. We'll get into that next week.